Ryan heard the communication officer Danny Walsh report with urgency that there was an emergency transmission from the cargo ship Western Star, and they were under attack by unknown vessels and multiple hostiles with weapons firing. Ryan was on his feet instantly and asked how far, and the navigation officer Claire Davis answered 18 minutes at maximum speed. Ryan ordered to plot intercept course and told Beth to sound battle stations, and told Danny to broadcast a general warning on all frequencies and let everyone in this sector know the Hampton is responding. As the crew rushed to their stations, Ryan pulled up the tactical display, and the Western Star was a civilian ship lightly armed and carrying medical supplies to a frontier colony, and 3 unidentified ships had her trapped and were systematically destroying her shields. Weapons Officer Marcus Lee reported that they would be in weapons range in 14 minutes. Ryan asked Danny if he could identify the attackers, and Danny said he was working on it, sir, and their drive signatures match known pirate patterns, and it looks like they are testing whether humanity's new reputation extends to protecting civilian shipping. Ryan's jaw tightened, and this was exactly what he had been expecting, and the Defiant had established humanity's willingness to die rather than surrender. And now the galaxy was testing whether they would extend that same protection to their civilian population. Ryan ordered communications to prepare a message for the attacking vessels, and told Marcus to bring the Mark 7 package to standby status, and said, "Let us show them our teeth." The Hampton dropped from faster-than-light travel directly between the Western Star and her attackers, and the 3 pirate vessels were smaller than the Hampton, but still dangerous, and they had weapons clearly stolen or taken from military sources. Ryan broadcast on all frequencies and said, "This is Captain Ryan Cooper of the Colonial Defense Force Heavy Cruiser Hampton, and you are attacking a human civilian vessel in violation of space law, and power down your weapons immediately, and prepare to be boarded or we will respond with lethal force." The lead pirate ship's response was a weapons lock and a burst of plasma fire aimed at the Hampton's front section. Beth reported that shields are holding and they are really doing this, and her voice showed disbelief. Ryan had hoped for a peaceful resolution, but he had prepared for this outcome and told Marcus to disable their engines and said, "I want them alive to face trial." Marcus said, "Yes, sir," and the Hampton's main cannon spoke with precision, and magnetic rounds crossed the distance at speeds close to light, and they slammed into the lead pirate's engineering section, and the ship's drive core went dark, leaving it drifting. The other 2 pirates scattered and tried to flank the Hampton while keeping fire on the Western Star. Ryan ordered Claire to bring them about and protect the Star, and asked Danny if the pirates were calling for help. Danny said, "No, sir, and they are jamming all frequencies except our direct channel," and he looked up from his console and said, "Captain, they are coordinating their attacks, and this is not random piracy, and someone planned this." Ryan understood immediately, and this was a test, and someone wanted to see if a single human warship would really risk mutual destruction to protect a cargo ship, and someone wanted to know if the Defiant's sacrifice was an isolated incident or the new standard for humanity. Ryan asked Beth how many crew were on those pirate vessels, and she said, "Scanning now, and approximately 40 on each ship and mixed species, and it looks like genuine pirate operations, not military. 120 lives total." And Ryan did the math instantly, and if he activated the Mark 7, everyone died, and the pirates and the Western Star and his own crew of 208 souls, and it was the exact calculation Jake Morrison had faced, but scaled larger. The second pirate ship scored a direct hit on the Western Star's bridge, and atmosphere vented into space. Danny said urgently that Captain the Star is reporting casualties and hull breaches on multiple decks, and they cannot take another hit like that. Decision time, and Ryan could destroy the pirates with regular weapons, but it would take time, and the Western Star might not survive, or he could activate the Mark 7 and end the fight instantly, but at the cost of everyone present, or he could try something new. Ryan told Danny to open a channel and make sure everyone can hear this, including any observers in the system. When the channel opened, Ryan spoke calmly but with absolute certainty and said, "Attention pirate vessels, and I am now activating my ship's Mark 7 black hole device, and you have 60 seconds to cease fire and withdraw. And if you continue your attack, we will all die together, and your choice." In engineering, the reactor core began its distinctive hum as safety protocols shut down. On the pirate ships, panic erupted, and these were not trained military crews prepared to face death, but they were criminals and opportunists who had thought a civilian target would be easy prey. The lead pirate, still drifting with dead engines, transmitted a desperate plea and said, "Wait, and we are withdrawing, and do not activate that thing." Ryan replied, "Then cease fire immediately, and all ships power down weapons and prepare to be boarded." The two mobile pirate vessels broke off their attack, and their engines flared as they turned away from the Hampton. But they did not run, and they could not because with the Mark 7 active, if they tried to jump to faster than light travel, the gravity disruption might trigger the black hole early. Beth reported they are complying and weapons powered down and they are just sitting there. Ryan ordered Marcus to keep firing solutions locked, and if any of them so much as charges a weapon, destroy them, and then to engineering he said, "Stand down. The Mark 7, but keep it ready, and I want them to remember how close they came." The reactor core's hum faded and relief swept through the bridge, and Ryan had played it perfectly, using the threat of mutual destruction without having to execute it. Ryan told Beth to send boarding parties and said, "I want every pirate in custody," within the hour, and told Danny to broadcast the entire incident to Fleet Command with an emergency flag, and let us make sure everyone knows what happened here. As his crew moved to secure the prisoners, Ryan settled back into his command chair, and he had faced his first test as captain of a Mark 7 equipped vessel, and he had proven Jake Morrison's policy worked, and you did not have to activate the weapon, and you just had to be willing to. The galaxy was learning a new rule: and leave humans alone or face oblivion, and it was brutal and uncompromising and absolutely effective. 2 hours later, with the pirates secured and the Western Star under tow, Ryan stood in his office writing his report, and Admiral Hayes would want every detail of how the confrontation had played out. A signal at his door announced Beth's arrival, and she said, "The Western Star's captain wants to thank you personally, sir." Ryan said, "Send her in," and the woman who entered looked exhausted, and her uniform was scorched and torn, and she said, "Captain Cooper, I am Captain Laura Bennett of the Western Star and my crew, and I owe you our lives." Ryan told her to sit and said, "Just doing my job, Captain," and asked how many casualties. Laura said 4 dead and 12 wounded, and it would have been much worse without your help. And she leaned forward and asked, "Can I ask you something? And would you really have done it and activated the Mark 7? Ryan met her eyes and saw fear there, and fear of him and of what he represented and of the choice he had almost made. Ryan said yes without hesitation, because if I had not been willing to, those pirates would have known, and they would have kept attacking, and more people would have died. And the only thing that saved us today was their belief that I meant what I said." Laura nodded slowly and said, "We are living in a strange new galaxy, are we not? And where the threat of suicide is a legitimate defensive strategy." Ryan corrected her and said, "It is not suicide, and it is consequence. And actions have consequences. Now, and if you attack humans, you die, and maybe we die too, but you definitely die, and that is the new rule." Laura asked, "And if they call your bluff?" And Ryan's expression hardened, and he said, "It is not a bluff, and ask the Zethran and ask their 300 warships." And he stood signaling the meeting was over and said, "Get your ship to port, Captain Bennett, and you have repairs to make and families to notify." After she left, Ryan returned to his window staring at the stars, and somewhere out there, the recording of today's incident was spreading across the galactic network, and another example confirming humanity's policy, and another proof of humans being willing to use their most terrible weapon. The Defiant had smiled first, showing the galaxy humanity's teeth, and now the Hampton and countless other ships were reinforcing that message, and proving it was not an isolated incident, but a fundamental shift in how humans approached conflict. And the galaxy would adapt because it always did, and new treaties would be written and new strategies developed. But one thing was certain, and humanity would never again be dismissed as weak or easy prey, and they had earned their place among the stars the hard way, with sacrifice and the willingness to embrace mutual destruction. And it was not pretty and it was not noble, but it was effective. And Ryan had learned from Jake Morrison's example that effectiveness was what mattered when survival was on the line, and the galaxy had learned to fear the human smile, and now it was learning to respect it. War Master Shendra stood before the council, and his career was in ruins and his family was disgraced, and he declared that the humans possess no honor, and to weaponize their own deaths and to destroy themselves in order to achieve victory violates every principle of civilized warfare. Counselor Vreen replied coldly, "And yet they won, and our fleet is destroyed, and our expansion plans are cancelled, and our rivals see us as weakened prey." And she leaned forward and said, "Tell me, War Master, What good are your principles when the enemy refuses to die according to our rules? Shendra had no answer. Vreen continued and said the council has decided and all military operations against human territories are suspended indefinitely, and we will offer formal apologies and war payments, and we will never ever corner another human ship without considering the cost. The decision was unanimous. Meanwhile, in the independent systems, the balance of power was shifting, and species that had relied on physical strength in large numbers were scrambling to adapt to humanity's new policy, and building more ships, no longer guaranteed victory if a single desperate human vessel could take entire fleets to oblivion. The age of simple conquest was over, and in its place came an era of careful diplomacy, where starting a war meant accepting the possibility of victories that cost too much and mutual destruction. Humanity had not become the strongest species in the galaxy, but they had become the most dangerous to threaten. Back on Earth, Admiral Hayes stood before the Joint Chiefs and the colonial government delivering her quarterly report, and the room was packed with officials who had once questioned the Mark VII program, and they had called it barbaric and unnecessary. They were not questioning it anymore. Hayes reported that the strategic situation has stabilized, and hostile incursions into our territory have ceased, and 3 major powers have requested formal alliance treaties, and the Galactic Council has stopped blocking our exploration and colonization work. Director Samantha Pierce from Colonial Affairs asked at what cost, and we have made ourselves outcasts and other species look at us with fear, not friendship. Hayes replied bluntly that fear is better than contempt, and for 30 years we were seen as easy targets, and our merchants were robbed and our colonies were raided, and our diplomats were ignored, and all because the galaxy saw us as weak newcomers who could be pushed around. And she pointed to the display showing the current tactical map and said now they see us as dangerous equals and I will take that trade. The room fell silent, and finally the chairman of Colonial Defense spoke and said the Defiance mission was a success then. Hayes confirmed in every measurable way, and Captain Morrison and his crew accomplished exactly what they set out to do, and they changed how humanity is perceived across the galaxy. Pierce pressed and asked if another situation arises and if we are forced to deploy the Mark VII again. Hayes met her eyes without flinching and said, "Then we will, and as many times as necessary, and the galaxy needs to understand that humanity does not bluff, and when we say we will take you with us, we mean it." The meeting ended with approval for expanded Mark VII deployment across the fleet, and as the officials left, Hayes remained behind staring at the tactical display. 47 lives for humanity's future, and it was a brutal calculation, but one she would make again if necessary. And in a galaxy full of predators, sometimes the only way to survive was to become the threat too dangerous to attack. The Defiant had smiled back at the alien Armada, and in that smile the galaxy had seen humanity's teeth. 6 months after the incident, Captain Ryan Cooper walked through the corridors of his new command. The heavy cruiser Hampton, and the ship was fresh from the construction yards and gleaming with new paint and equipped with the latest technology, and including in a sealed chamber deep in engineering, a Mark VII package 3 times more powerful than the one the Defiant had carried. His executive officer, Commander Beth Winters, walked beside him and said, "Captain, we have received our patrol assignment and the Kessian frontier near the disputed zones." Ryan nodded, and the Kessian frontier had been a trouble spot of piracy and territorial disputes for years, and now with humanity's expanded claims and new reputation, they were patrolling zones that would have been considered too dangerous 6 months ago. Ryan asked how is the crew settling in, and Beth said, "Good sir, and morale is high," and she paused and said, "Most of them signed up because of the Defiant, and they want to serve with the species that fights back." Ryan understood, and the Defiant incident had become more than a military operation, and it had become a symbol and a rallying cry, and humanity the species that refused to surrender, and the species that turned their own ships into weapons rather than accept defeat. Ryan asked if they had received any updates from fleet intelligence, and Beth said, "Yes, sir," and 3 separate incidents in the last week, and a Vendorian patrol challenged one of our cargo ships in the shipping lanes, and the cargo ship captain transmitted her ship specifications and informed them she was carrying a Mark VII type device. Ryan asked, and Beth said the Vendorians apologized for the trouble and withdrew immediately, and she said it with a slight smile. Around the bridge, the crew exchanged knowing looks, and the message had been received loud and clear across the galaxy, and threatening a human ship, any human ship, meant risking a black hole event, and no amount of military advantage was worth that gamble. Beth continued and said, second incident, and Zethran merchants filed a formal complaint with the Galactic Council claiming our trade practices are unfair. Ryan asked, did the council take action? And Beth said the council informed the Zethran that all human trade practices fall within legal limits and suggested they focus on rebuilding their fleet instead of filing complaints. This time, several crew members actually laughed, and the Zethran, who had spent years harassing human shipping, were now being dismissed by the same council that had once enabled their aggression. Ryan asked about the third incident, though he suspected he could guess. Beth said the Kothian Assembly voted to adopt human-style black hole deterrence protocols for their own fleet, and they have requested technical help from Earth. Ryan stopped walking and said they want to build their own Mark 7 devices. Beth confirmed it seems so, and Earth Command declined, stating that the technology is classified and not available for export, but the Kothians are trying anyway. Ryan whistled softly and said if other species start using black hole weapons, the entire galactic balance changes. Beth said it already has, and Ryan said quietly, we started something that day and something that cannot be undone. And he looked around. His bridge at the young crew who had volunteered to serve on a ship carrying the galaxy's most controversial weapon, and they knew what they had signed up for. The Hampton reached the edge of known space and made the jump to faster-than-light travel heading for the Kessian frontier, and the journey would take 6 days, and Ryan spent that time learning every system on his new command. On the 4th day, they received a distress signal. Kepler Station's commercial district stood frozen in absolute silence, and beings from species that had traveled space for thousands of years stared at the screens in shock, and they could not process what they had just witnessed. The Zethran traders. Translator made a strangled sound and he said, they killed themselves and the humans killed themselves just to destroy our fleet. Chenlei corrected him and his voice carried in the silence, and he said no. They sent a message. Within minutes, the recording began spreading across the galactic network, and the Galactic Council tried to suppress it, and they declared the footage classified and possibly fake, but their efforts were useless because traders shared it on secret channels, and military analysts studied every frame, and news organizations on 100 worlds broadcast it despite government warnings. The message spread like wildfire, and with it came a single terrifying question, which was how many more human ships carry this capability. On the Vendorian homeworld, Fleet Coordinator Shress watched the recording for the 5th time, and his primary hearts were racing fast, and the Vendorian Empire had been planning an aggressive expansion into human-claimed territories, and they were confident that humanity's limited fleet could be overwhelmed by superior numbers. Those plans were being burned in his office right now. He ordered his assistant to send a diplomatic representative to Earth immediately, and we need to negotiate new territorial agreements, and favorable ones, and very favorable ones. In the Kothian assembly chambers, Ambassador Vila argued passionately against recognizing humanity's expanded claims, and she said they are a young species and reckless and violent, and this action proves they cannot be trusted with power. High Minister Court interrupted her and said this action proves they will not be bullied, and they sacrificed 47 of their own to eliminate a threat and send a message. And how many more will they sacrifice if we push them, and how many of their ships will they turn into weapons if we declare war? The Assembly voted to recognize humanity's territorial claims by a margin of 73 to 12. On Earth, in the Colonial Defense Force headquarters, Admiral Patricia Hayes sat in her office surrounded by communication requests from every major government and organization in known space, and some demanded explanations and others offered alliances, and a few threatened payback for the violation of black hole weapons treaties. She ignored them all and stared at the memorial display on her wall, and 47 names had been added today, and 47 crew members of the Defiant who had volunteered for a mission knowing they would not return. Captain Jake Morrison's name was at the top of the list. Hayes raised a glass of whiskey to the display and said, "You did it, Jake, and you showed them, and no more second-class treatment, and no more being dismissed as weak newcomers." And she took a drink and felt the burn and said, "The galaxy knows now, and we are not prey, and we are not victims, and we are humans." Her communication device chimed with an incoming message marked urgent, and she almost ignored it before recognizing the origin code, and it was from the Galactic Council itself and from the Office of the Supreme Chancellor. The message was brief, and it said humanity is hereby granted full council membership and voting rights, and all previous territorial restrictions are lifted, and we would like to discuss security arrangements for mutual protection. Hayes allowed herself a small, grim smile, and the Defiance crew had bought humanity's future with their lives, and they had paid in the only currency that mattered in the galaxy: fear. 3 weeks after the Defiant incident, Lieutenant Commander Ryan Cooper stood in the Memorial Garden at Colonial Defense Force Academy, staring at the newest monument, and it was carved from black marble and shaped like a ship's front pointed toward the sky, and it had 47 names in gold letters. Ryan had served with Jake Morrison 10 years ago before the captain had received his own command, and they had been young officers together, sharing drinks and discussing their dreams for humanity's future among the stars. Ryan whispered to the stone and said, "I always knew you would do something crazy, Jake, and I just thought you would live to tell the story afterward." A voice said behind him that he did live to tell it, and just not in the way you expected. Ryan turned to find Katie Sullivan's sister, Nina, standing with flowers in her hands, and her eyes were red but dry because she had done her crying already. Nina said, "Katie sent me a message 3 days before the mission, and she said if anything happened I should remember that she chose this, and they all did." Ryan asked, "Chose to die," and he could not keep the bitterness from his voice. Nina corrected him and said, "Chose to matter, and do you know how many human colonies have been raided by pirates this month? And the answer is 0. And do you know how many diplomatic incidents the Galactic Council has tried to push on us? And the answer is none. And for the first time since we reached the stars, the galaxy is treating us like equals." She pointed to the monument and said, "That is what they bought with their lives, and not just survival, but respect." Ryan wanted to argue and to say there must have been another way, but he had read the classified reports and he knew the Zethran had been planning a full-scale invasion of human space, and they were confident that humanity's limited fleet could not stop them, and the Defiant sacrifice had ended those plans before they began. Ryan said quietly, "The Mark 7 package, and every ship has one now, and Nina confirmed that every warship does, and every cargo ship captain has received classified instructions on how to rig their reactor for the same effect if necessary." She met his eyes and said, "The Admiral made her decision, and if the galaxy wants to fight us, they will pay for every victory in blood and ships, and we might not win, but we will make sure they lose too." It was a dark philosophy born from humanity's position as the weakest of the space-traveling species, but it was working, and the aggressive empires were backing down, and the neutral powers were seeking alliances, and even the Galactic Council, which had spent decades treating humanity like troublesome children, now asked for Earth's favor.
Ryan said he had a new assignment, and the Hampton and she is one of the new heavy cruisers fresh from the shipyards. Nina said, "Congratulations, and I hear those new ships have improved Mark 7 packages and larger black hole radius and better targeting parameters."
Ryan nodded slowly, and every advancement in human weapons technology now came with the threat of mutual destruction, and it was a dangerous balance, but it was keeping humanity safe. Nina added that Katie would be proud, and she always said humans were at their best when backed into a corner. Across the academy grounds, a new class of students was drilling on the parade field, and they were young men and women who had signed up after the Defiant incident, and they were inspired by the crew's sacrifice, and enrollment at the academy had tripled in 3 weeks. Ryan observed that the galaxy thinks we are crazy, and Nina replied that the galaxy is right, but they are learning that crazy does not mean weak, and sometimes it means dangerous. Far from Earth on the Zethran homeworld, the Collective Council met in emergency session, and the loss of 300 warships had shattered their military strength and their confidence. And worse, the recordings of the incident had sparked internal problems, and citizens were questioning why the military had provoked an enemy capable of such devastating revenge. Now, in the present moment, with the Zethran Armada surrounding them, that statement was about to be delivered in the most spectacular way possible. And the Mark 7 package was the result of humanity's last 50 years of weapons research, and, while other species built bigger guns and stronger shields, human engineers had asked a different question, which was, if we cannot win, then how do we make sure nobody else wins either? The answer was devastatingly simple. and every human warship's reactor core could be made unstable in a controlled way that would create a temporary black hole, and for about 3 seconds, a tiny black hole would exist, and it would pull in everything within 10,000 kilometers before collapsing back into normal space. 3 seconds was enough. Katie Sullivan's voice came through the speaker, and her usual humor was replaced by serious determination, and she said, "Captain, the package is armed and ready, and the reactor destabilization sequence is locked in, and we are looking at a 97% chance of success." Morrison asked about the 3%, and Katie said the black hole does not collapse, and in that case it will keep growing until it eats this entire star system. But at least we will take the Zethran with us. Greg Palmer spoke up from the weapons station and said, "Captain, their flagship is charging weapons, and all 300 ships are locked onto us, and they are getting ready to fire." Morrison watched the tactical display, and the Zethran commander had made a fatal mistake, because in their arrogance they had pulled their entire fleet into close formation, because they wanted to make sure the human ship was completely destroyed, and they had created the perfect killing field for themselves. Amy asked how long until they were in weapons range, and Morrison told her 15 seconds, and then he asked Katie how long until the Mark 7 reached critical, and she said once you give the command it will be 12 seconds until the black hole forms. Morrison did the math, and it would be close, but they might be able to trigger the cascade before the Zethran could destroy them. And it was possible, but only just possible. Lisa Carter said from navigation that she was picking up something strange, and the spatial coordinates where they were located were not random, were they? And Morrison looked at her and asked what she meant. Lisa said this exact location is a major trade route meeting point, and dozens of species pass through this sector every day, and her eyes got wide. And she said, if we detonate here, the recordings will spread across the entire galaxy within hours. Lucas Bennett said quietly, "That is the point, Lieutenant, because the Admiral did not just want us to stop the Zethran, but she wanted every species in the galaxy to see what happens when you push humanity too far." The bridge fell silent as everyone understood the weight of their mission, and they were not just 47 crew members about to die, but they were messengers carrying humanity's new policy to every corner of known space. "We will not be conquered, and we will not surrender, and if you try to destroy us, we will drag you into oblivion with us." Amy Brooks announced 5 seconds to weapons range, and Morrison straightened in his command chair and told Katie to start the Mark 7 on his signal, and told Greg to target the enemy flagship's bridge because he wanted the last thing their commander sees to be our weapons lock. Both officers said yes, sir, and the Zethran Armada completed its targeting, and 300 warships, all bristling with enough firepower to crack a planet, were all focused on one small human ship. Amy shouted, "They are firing," and Morrison roared his command to start now. Deep in the Defiance engineering section, Katie Sullivan pulled the final lever, and the reactor core's safety systems shut down in order one after another, and each failure was deliberately designed, and the cascade began. On the bridge, Greg Palmer's targeting computer got a lock, and his finger pressed the trigger, and the Defiance main cannon fired one last shot of defiance toward the Zethran flagship. 300 beams of destructive energy cut through space toward the human ship, and in engineering, the reactor core began to sing a song that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. Light years away in the neutral trading station, called Kepler Station, a man named Chen Lei was negotiating a shipping contract with a Vendorian merchant when every display screen in the commercial area suddenly changed and showed something else. The image showed a tactical view of 300 warships surrounding a single ship, and the timestamp said the transmission was happening right now and live. The Vendorian made clicking sounds that his translator worked to interpret, and he asked, "What is this?" And Chen Lei felt his blood run cold as he recognized the human ship's design, and he said, "That is one of ours, and that is a Colonial Defense Force patrol ship." Around them, merchants and travelers from a dozen species stopped their business to watch the screens, and the audio transmission from Captain Morrison played through the station's speakers, and his words were calm and measured, despite the impossible odds. He said, "You are about to find out why humanity does not build escape pods anymore, and we do not plan to survive, and we plan to take you with us." A Zethran trader standing near Chen Lei made a sound that might have been laughter, and said, "Foolish. Humans and that captain thinks bravery will save him, and the collective fleet will reduce that ship to atoms. Lei did not respond because he was too busy calculating distances and reading the technical data. Streaming across the bottom of the display, and the reactor signature from the human ship was spiking in a pattern that seemed deliberately controlled, and whatever was happening, it was not random. On the screens, the Zethran Armada opened fire and 300 beams of energy converged on the Defiant's position. And then space itself began to scream. The visual sensors recording the event struggled to process what was happening, and at the exact center of the Zethran formation, a point of absolute darkness appeared, and it was no larger than a fist, and for a moment, nothing seemed to change. Then the warships closest to the black hole began to stretch, and their hulls bent and twisted as gravity grabbed them with unstoppable force, and the beams of energy that had been fired at the Defiant curved away from their target and were drawn into the growing darkness like water going down a drain. The Zethran trader whispered impossible and said, "That is quantum collapse and that is a black hole." Lei replied softly, "That is humanity." For 3 eternal seconds, the black hole fed and warships by the dozen tumbled into oblivion, and their shields and armor meant nothing against the fundamental force of the universe, and the Zethran flagship caught closest to the center came apart like wet paper, and its crew of 3,000 souls were gone in an instant. The lucky ones died first, and ships on the outer edges of the formation had precious moments to realize what was happening and to try starting their faster-than-light drives in desperate escape attempts, but none succeeded because the gravitational shear tore them apart before they could jump. 273 Zethran warships were destroyed in those 3 seconds, and the remaining 27 positioned at the very edge of the formation suffered terrible damage, and only 4 kept the ability to limp away. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the black hole collapsed back into normal space, and where 300 warships had been, only debris remained, and there was twisted metal and frozen atmosphere and silence. Of the human ship Defiant there was no trace. The warning sirens filled every corner of the Defiant as 300 alien ships appeared from nowhere, and Captain Jake Morrison stood at his command post watching the screen that showed him surrounded by enemies on all sides, and his hands gripped the metal rail in front of him as he tried to stay calm, even though his heart was beating faster than normal, because he knew this was bad, and very bad indeed. And Lieutenant Amy Brooks sat at her station looking at all the sensor readings, and she spoke in a steady voice even though everyone could see the fear in her eyes when she said they were completely trapped, with no way to escape, and the enemy had formed a perfect sphere around them like a cage made of warships. The Defiant was just a patrol ship doing regular work in the outer space territories when the attack happened, and she only had 47 people on board, and all of them were trained soldiers, but they were so outnumbered that it seemed impossible to survive, and the Zethran aliens had brought enough firepower to destroy an entire planet. And Commander Lucas Bennett walked over to stand next to Morrison, and he told the captain that the enemy flagship was calling them, and it was audio only. Morrison nodded and told him to let the message come through, and a voice that sounded like metal scraping against metal filled the bridge and said that the human ship had entered Zethran territory, and they must power down all weapons and get ready to be boarded, or else they would be destroyed completely, and the voice made it sound so simple and so final. The captain looked around at his crew and saw engineer Katie Sullivan at her station with her fingers moving quickly over the controls that managed the ship's power, and weapons officer Greg Palmer was watching his screens with his jaw tight as he checked how much ammunition they had left, and navigation officer Lisa Carter was trying to find escape routes, even though everyone knew there were none. Morrison opened a channel and spoke clearly and said, "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth Colonial Defense Force, and these territories were claimed by humanity 12 years ago under our expansion laws, and we will not give up our ship." And then he closed the channel and waited. There was a long silence before the Zethran commander replied and said, "Then you will die, and you have 60 seconds to change your mind." And the connection went dead. Morrison turned to his crew and announced to everyone on the ship that they should go to battle stations and seal all the doors between sections and send all available power to weapons and shields, and his voice carried through every corridor and every room. Amy Brooks looked up from her console and said quietly that even at full power, their shields would only last about 30 seconds against that much enemy fire, and Morrison said he knew, but they were not going to make it easy for the aliens. He leaned forward and spoke into his communications device and asked Katie how much power she could give him. And from the engineering section, Katie's voice came back, saying she could give him everything they had. But if he was thinking what she thought he was thinking, then it was going to be one amazing light show. Morrison allowed himself a small smile because the Zethran thought they had cornered helpless prey. But they were about to learn something important about humans, and that was that humans do not surrender, and humans do not beg. And when humans are backed into a corner with no hope of surviving, then humans do something that the rest of the galaxy finds completely crazy. They smile back. Morrison gave an order to Lieutenant Brooks to activate the Mark 7 package, and every single crew member on the bridge went completely still, because the Mark 7 was experimental and unauthorized and technically illegal under 3 different space treaties, but it was also humanity's biggest secret, and it had been installed on every warship without any of the other alien species knowing about it. Amy Brooks's hand shook just a little bit as she typed in her security code and said the package was activated and waiting for the final command to release it. Morrison told Greg to target the enemy flagship and told Lucas to broadcast everything on all frequencies because he wanted the entire galaxy to hear what was going to happen next. The Zethran Armada began moving into attack positions, and weapon signatures showed up on the Defiant sensors as 300 ships got ready to fire all at the same time, and the countdown had reached 0. Lucas Bennett said they were now broadcasting to everyone, and Morrison's smile got wider, and he spoke to the Zethran Collective and said, "This is Captain Jake Morrison, and you wanted to know what happens when you corner a human ship with no hope of escape." And he paused for a moment before saying his next words that would echo across all of known space, and he said, "You're about to find out why humanity does not build escape pods anymore." His finger moved over the release command, and he said, "We do not plan to survive, and we plan to take you with us." The Defiant's hull began to vibrate with barely controlled energy as the Mark 7 package came online, and in that moment, the human ship did not just smile back at the alien armada, but it showed its teeth, and they were sharp. 24 hours earlier, Jake Morrison had been drinking coffee in his private office when the secret transmission arrived from Earth Command, and the message was short and marked with the highest security level, and it was signed by Admiral Patricia Hayes herself. The message said, "Captain Morrison, our intelligence reports suggest the Zethran Collective is preparing to test human strength in the outer territories, and your ship has been selected for a special operation, and do not try to avoid contact, and do not retreat, and show them who we are." Attached to the message was a classified file that explained the Mark 7 package that had been secretly installed during the Defiant's last maintenance period, and Morrison read through the technical details 3 times, and each time he read it his blood felt colder. The Mark 7 was not a weapon in the normal sense, but it was a philosophy turned into reality, and it was humanity's answer to a galaxy that saw them as weak newcomers who could only be exploited or killed. And every human warship carried one, but none of the other species knew. When Lucas Bennett came into the office that day, he found his captain staring out the window at the stars, and Lucas said, "You have read the file?" And it was a statement, not a question. Morrison said yes, he had read it, and those crazy engineers actually built it, and actually put one on every ship, and Lucas poured himself some coffee from the captain's private supply, and said, "The Council is going to lose their minds when they find out, because this violates at least a dozen space laws." Morrison turned from the window and said, "The Galactic Council has spent the last 30 years treating humanity like children, and they have denied us seats at important meetings, and restricted where we can expand and turned a blind eye when species like the Zethran harass our colonies," and his voice got harder. And he said, "Maybe it is time they learned that we are not asking for permission anymore." Lucas nodded slowly and said, "The Admiral wants us to make an example," and Morrison corrected him and said, "No, she wants us to make a statement."